Have you ever been laughed at for believing in something everyone else called outdated? Keep watching, because what happened in this Iowa swamp in 1992 changed everything those engineers thought they knew. On a Tuesday morning in September, Robert Mitchell stood at the edge of a swamp and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days earlier, his company's newest piece of equipment, a Caterpillar 375 excavator worth $600,000 of hydraulic power and computerized precision, had broken through what the surveyors promised was solid ground. The machine dropped like a stone, its 60-ton weight punching through the thin crust of dried earth into bottomless black muck beneath. Now the excavator sat in the swamp like a wounded beast buried to its cab, yellow paint, streaked with mud tracks completely invisible beneath the surface. Every hour it seemed to sink another inch. The September sun beat down on Clayton County, turning the air thick and still. Bob pulled off his hard hat and ran a hand through thinning hair gone gray at the temples. 45 years old, 20 years building Mitchell Construction from nothing. And this disaster threatened to undo it all. The Highway 52 expansion project stretched behind him, a scar of raw earth and concrete pilings cutting through Iowa farmland. State contract, 30-day deadline. Penalty clauses that made his stomach turn. Every day behind schedule cost $20,000. 3 days lost already, $60,000 and counting. Bob stood watching his career sink inch by inch, but he had no idea that salvation would come from the man he'd spent years dismissing. Kenneth Anderson, his chief engineer, walked up with a clipboard and a face that said the news wasn't good. 35 years old, MIT degree, the best mind Bob had ever hired. Kenneth had calculated every angle, run every scenario through computer models. None of it mattered now. The numbers don't work, boss. Ground pressure exceeds bearing capacity by a factor of 3. We're basically trying to pull 60 tons out of pudding. Bob stared at the excavator. The cab windows caught the afternoon light, mocking him with their gleam. Inside that cabin, gauges and computers worth $100,000 sat useless. The machine had sunk 8 feet into the swamp. The tracks, each one weighing 3 tons, had vanished completely. Only the upper frame and cab remained visible, listing slightly to the left as the ground beneath gave way with geological patience. Rebecca Clark, project manager, approached from the construction trailer, 38 years old, hired away from a competitor 2 years ago. Sharp mind, sharper tongue. She carried a phone and wore the expression of someone who'd just finished a difficult conversation with corporate. Home office wants answers. They're asking if we need to write off the excavator entirely. Insurance won't cover operator error, and, according to the fine print, driving into a swamp counts as operator error. Bob turned away from the swamp. Behind him, the construction site sprawled across 100 acres. Concrete forms waited for pour. Rebar grids lay exposed to weather. A dozen pieces of equipment sat idle because the excavator had been the linchpin of the entire operation. 40 men on payroll with nothing to do but watch the clock. Union contracts meant he couldn't send them home without pay. Brandon Walker, the equipment operator who'd been driving when the excavator broke through, stood near the trailer. 28 years old, good worker, family man. The guilt showed in his shoulders the way he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The surveyor had marked it solid ground. Brandon had just been following the plan. Bob had tried everything. On the first day, he'd brought in two Caterpillar D8 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck machine. Those dozers, 300 horsepower, each 40 tons of pushing power, represented the pinnacle of modern earth-moving technology. They'd pulled until their own tracks started to slip, until the chains groaned with tension, until one chain snapped with a sound like a gunshot that echoed across the flatland and sent workers diving for cover. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. On the second day, Bob called in a recovery company from Des Moines. Specialists in heavy equipment extraction, they arrived with a truck-mounted winch rated for 50 tons and enough cable to span half a mile. The crew spent 4 hours setting up, anchoring the winch to a concrete foundation they'd poured specifically for this purpose, 6 feet deep, reinforced with rebar, cured for 18 hours. The winch screamed. The cable stretched. The anchor, 2 cubic yards of concrete weighing 6 tons, ripped out of the ground like a weed. And the excavator, it sank another 6 inches. The recovery crew packed up without a word. Their invoice arrived by fax an hour later, $8,000 for attempting the impossible. On the third day, Bob rented a crane. The operator, a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen every kind of extraction job, took one look at the swamp and shook his head before Bob even finished explaining. "That ground won't hold me. You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1. The crane sat on its flatbed trailer at the site entrance unused while the rental meter kept running. Kenneth ran calculations on his laptop numbers, scrolling past too fast for anyone else to follow. His MIT education had taught him to trust mathematics, to believe every problem had a solution if you just found the right equation. But the equations kept returning the same answer: impossible. "What about a helicopter?" Rebecca asked. "A sky crane could lift it straight up." Bob had already checked. The nearest sky crane sat in Minnesota. $15,000 per hour minimum 8-hour deployment. 2 days to arrive. By then, the excavator would be underground, and they'd be pulling out a hunk of metal worth nothing but scrap value. "We could drain the swamp." With what Kenneth gestured at the black water pooling around the excavator. "That swamp is fed by an underground spring. We'd need a month, and pumps we don't have. By the time we got it dry, the contract would be forfeit." "Insurance," Bob laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error. And according to the fine print I read 3 times last night, driving into a swamp counts as operator error. We're on our own." The engineers fell silent. Around them, the construction site hummed with the peculiar quiet of a project at standstill. No engines running, no metal striking metal, just the sound of wind across open ground and the occasional splash as the excavator settled another fraction of an inch deeper into the mud. But what nobody on that site knew was that Bob had spent 20 years building Mitchell Construction to prove he wasn't a failure. Every project mattered, every deadline counted, and this excavator sinking into the mud felt like watching everything he'd built slowly disappear. His father had failed at a bridge project in 1975, lost everything. The family home, the business, his reputation. Bob was 12 years old when he watched his father sell their furniture to pay debts. He'd sworn then, standing in an empty living room that still smelled like his mother's cooking, that he'd never fail like that, never let a project beat him, never stand helpless while disaster unfolded. Now here he stood, helpless, watching disaster unfold in slow motion. Kenneth closed his laptop. The numbers were clear. They had no solution. Modern engineering computer models, Hydraulic power precision equipment had met its match in 8 feet of Iowa mud. That's when the John Deere tractor pulled up to the edge of the construction site. The sound came first, not the high whine of modern diesel, but the deeper chug of an older engine. Bob turned irritated at the interruption, expecting a local farmer come to complain about the noise or the dust, or the way heavy trucks had torn up the county road. The tractor was older than Bob. Green paint faded to a color that existed somewhere between mint and moss. Rust spots on the hood, one fender dented from some long-ago collision. But the engine ran smooth, and the man who climbed down moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Harold McCormick was 73 years old. 5 decades of Iowa sun had weathered his face into a topographic map of wrinkles. His hands, when he pulled off his work gloves, showed calluses that had calluses. He wore overalls that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to something closer to gray. His boots, actual work boots, not the kind Bob bought at outdoor stores, carried mud that might have been there since spring planting. But his eyes were clear, sharp, the kind of eyes that saw things others missed. Bob barely glanced at him. The day had been long, the problems unsolvable, and the last thing he needed was a local farmer wasting his time. Sites closed to visitors, insurance liability. Hal McCormick didn't react to the dismissal. He'd heard variations of it his whole life. Too old, too backward, too stuck in the past. He walked to the edge of the swamp and looked at the excavator with the same expression he'd used to evaluate a sick cow clinical assessment mixed with practical concern. "I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor. Own the 400 acres past that tree line." He nodded toward the excavator, still not looking at Bob. "Saw your problem these past 3 days. Thought I might help." Bob turned then, really looked at the old man. Saw the worn overalls, the mud-caked boots, the 73-year-old face. Saw everything he'd spent his life proving he wasn't. Old, obsolete, unable to keep up with progress. "Help how I can pull that out." The words hung in the air between them. Kenneth stopped what he was doing. Rebecca's phone call forgotten, she stared. Brandon, standing near the trailer, actually took a step closer to hear better. 40 workers scattered across the site went quiet. Everyone had heard the old farmer's claim. Bob started to laugh. Let him tell you about that laugh because it matters. Robert Mitchell had built his company through force of will and refusal to accept limitations. He'd started with one backhoe and a pickup truck, worked 18-hour days for 20 years, bid on projects other contractors thought were impossible. He'd built bridges and highways and shopping centers. He employed 150 men. His equipment fleet was worth millions. Bob Mitchell was not a humble man. Success had taught him that he was smarter than most people, harder working than most people, better than most people. When he looked at Harold McCormick, at this old farmer in worn clothes with his ancient tractor, he saw everything he'd spent his life escaping. He saw obsolescence made flesh. So he laughed. "You can pull that out. With what, Grandpa, your John Deere? Not with the John Deere. With my steamer. My steam traction engine, case 1912 model, 110 horsepower. She's been in my family 80 years. The laughter spread. Kenneth chuckled. Workers who'd drifted closer grinned at each other. Bob wiped his eyes, relief flooding through him in the form of mockery. At least this was something he could control, putting an old fool in his place. A steam tractor from 1912. You want to pull out my $600,000 excavator with a steam tractor from 1912. That's right. Bob gestured at the idle bulldozers. I've got bulldozers that make more horsepower than your whole farm. They couldn't move that excavator an inch. What makes you think some antique museum piece is going to do better? Hal looked at the stuck excavator, then at the bulldozers sitting uselessly at the swamp's edge, then back at Bob. When he spoke, his voice carried the patience of a man who'd explained simple truths to stubborn people many times before. Your machines make horsepower. Mine makes torque. There's a difference. Enlighten me. Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. Your bulldozers spin fast, but they can't grip. They're designed for pushing dirt on solid ground, not pulling dead weight out of a swamp. My steamer was built to pull threshing machines through muddy fields all day long. 6-foot drive wheels with steel cleats. Weighs 22 tons herself. She doesn't spin. She grips. Bob shook his head, still smiling, but the smile had started to feel forced. Something in the old man's certainty unsettled him. This is adorable, really, but I've got a real problem here, and I don't have time for... You've had 3 days. Hal's interruption was quiet but absolute. The construction site went silent. Workers stopped pretending not to listen. Kenneth closed his laptop. Rebecca put down her phone. Even the wind seemed to pause. You've tried bulldozers. You've tried winches. You've tried a crane that wouldn't even get close. You're losing $20,000 a day in delays. You're out of options. He paused, letting the words settle. I'm not charging you anything. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing but an hour of your time. If it does work, you can make a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They're the ones helped me restore that engine. Bob looked at Harold McCormick for a long moment, looked at Kenneth, who shrugged with the helplessness of a man whose equations had run out, looked at Rebecca, whose corporate masters were demanding answers he didn't have, looked at the excavator sinking inch by patient inch into the Iowa mud. Fine, bring your museum piece. But when it falls apart trying to move that excavator, at least it'll give my men something to laugh about. Hal nodded, once turned and walked back to his John Deere without another word. The old tractor started with a belch of smoke and a sound like distant thunder. Bob watched him drive away, dust rising in a plume behind the tires. Kenneth stepped closer. Boss? You know he's crazy, right? Bob didn't answer. Something nagged at him. The old man's certainty, the way he'd looked at the excavator, not with fear or doubt, but with the calm assessment of someone sizing up a familiar task. Rebecca approached from the other side. Corporate wants a decision by end of day. Write it off or keep trying. Tell them we're trying one more option. What option? Bob gestured at the dust cloud marking Hal's departure. Apparently we're going old school. Let Bob tell you about the steam engine because it's the real hero of this story. The Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1912, the same year the Titanic sank and Woodrow Wilson was elected president. It was a monster of a machine. 22 tons of iron and steel with rear drive wheels, 6 feet in diameter, studded with steel cleats designed to grip any surface. The boiler could hold 150 gallons of water and generate enough steam pressure to move mountains. Harold's grandfather, August McCormick, had bought the engine new for $3,200, a fortune in 1912, more than most farms cost. August used it for 20 years, pulling threshing machines from farm to farm during harvest season, dragging stumps out of fields being cleared for planting, doing the heavy work that horses couldn't handle and early tractors couldn't manage. When gasoline tractors became common in the 1930s, most farmers scrapped their steamers. The old machines were expensive to operate, slow to start, required constant attention. But August McCormick couldn't bear to part with his. He parked it in a shed behind the barn and covered it with canvas, thinking he might need it again someday. He never did. August died in 1952, and the steam engine sat untouched for another 32 years. Harold rediscovered it in 1984 while cleaning out the old shed to make room for modern equipment storage. He pulled back the canvas and found the engine exactly as his grandfather had left it. Rusty, dusty, but intact. Every part still there. The boiler still held pressure when he tested it carefully. The gears still turned when he cranked them by hand. Harold spent 3 years restoring that engine. He found a retired machinist in Dubuque who remembered working on steamers in his youth. He tracked down original parts from collectors and museums across the Midwest. He learned to operate the machine from old manuals printed on paper, so brittle it crumbled at the edges. His wife, Rose, helped holding flashlights while he worked late into winter evenings, bringing coffee when the work got frustrating, believing in the project, even when everyone else called it a waste of time and money. $15,000, and thousands of hours later, the case was running again. Harold took it to county fairs and steam shows, demonstrated it for school groups, kept it in perfect working condition. He fired up the boiler once a month just to keep everything moving, just to hear the whistle echo across the Iowa flatland the way it had when his grandfather was young. He'd always known the old machine was powerful. He just never had a chance to prove how powerful. This wasn't just a machine. It was the last survivor from a time when American engineering meant building things that would outlast their makers. Have you ever known you could do something that everyone else said was impossible? Have you ever felt that certainty in your bones, that quiet confidence that comes from understanding something deeply, something the experts with their degrees and their equipment don't understand? Harold McCormick had that feeling as he drove his John Deere back to his farm. He'd watched the construction crews struggle for 3 days, watched their bulldozers spin uselessly, watched their winches strain and fail, watched their crane operator refuse to even try. He'd watched and thought about torque, about traction, about the difference between power and grip. He knew his grandfather's machine could do what their modern equipment couldn't. He just needed the chance to prove it. The farm sat 2 miles from the construction site, 400 acres that had been in the McCormick family since 1889. The house-white clapboard green shutters front porch that sagged slightly on the north end showed its age but held firm. The barn, newer by 50 years, housed modern tractors and combines. And behind the barn, in a shed August had built with his own hands in 1913, sat the steam engine. Harold parked the John Deere and walked to the shed. The doors, 12 feet tall, to accommodate the engine's smokestack, swung open on hinges he'd oiled just last week. Inside, the case waited in shadows that smelled of machine oil and old metal and history. He'd fired it up just 5 days ago, part of his monthly maintenance routine. The boiler would still have residual heat, but you couldn't rush a steamer. You had to build the fire slowly, let the water heat gradually, watch the pressure gauges with the patience of a man who understood that steam under pressure was dangerous if you didn't respect it. Harold checked his watch. 3:30 in the afternoon. 2 hours to build steam. 30 minutes to drive to the construction site. He could be there by 6 o'clock, still have good daylight for the work. He started gathering supplies, coal for the firebox, oil for the running gear. The heavy chain links as thick as a man's wrist forged steel that had been in his family as long as the engine itself. That chain had pulled threshing machines through mud that would have swallowed horses. It had dragged stumps out of ground so hard the roots squealed coming free. It had never broken, never even bent. At 4 o'clock, Harold opened the firebox and began building the fire. Not too fast. You had to let the metal expand gradually, or risk cracking the boiler. He used newspaper first, then kindling, then small pieces of coal, each layer, catching and building heat in incremental stages. The water in the boiler drained and refilled last week began to warm. Harold watched the temperature gauge climb. 100 degrees. 200. The first wisps of steam escaped from relief valves, a sound like a distant sigh. He thought about Rose. She'd died 5 years ago, cancer that moved too fast for the doctors to stop. They'd been married 47 years. She'd believed in this restoration project when everyone else thought he was crazy. She'd stood in this shed on cold January mornings, holding parts while he worked, never complaining about the time or the money or the fact that he was pouring their retirement savings into a machine that hadn't run in decades. It's your father's legacy, Hal, and your grandfather's. Keep it alive. Her words spoken in this very shed while snow fell outside, and the work seemed impossible. Harold had promised her then that he'd see it through. He'd kept that promise. The engine ran. The whistle sounded across the land just like it had 80 years ago. And now, finally, it would prove its worth in a way even Rose hadn't imagined. By 5:30, the pressure gauge read 150 pounds per square inch. Ready. Harold climbed onto the platform, tested the throttle, checked every gauge and valve one final time. Everything perfect. He opened the steam whistle, just a short burst, and the sound echoed across his land, announcing to anyone within 5 miles that something was about to happen. He put the engine in gear and drove it out of the shed. The machine moved at a stately 5 miles per hour, but the ground shook with each rotation of those massive drive wheels. The steel cleats bit into the gravel road, leaving impressions 3 inches deep. Black smoke rose from the stack. Steam hissed from joints and valves. The rhythmic chuff, chuff, chuff of the pistons sounded like the breathing of some enormous animal. Drivers on County Road 47 pulled over to stare. A machine like this hadn't traveled these roads in half a century. Kids playing in yards stopped and pointed, mouths open. An elderly man standing on his porch, Donald Harris, 82 years old, World War II veteran, raised his hand in a slow salute. Tears streaming down weathered cheeks. He remembered these machines from his childhood, remembered the harvest crews that traveled from farm to farm, remembered a time when steam power ruled the American heartland. Amanda Lewis, reporter for the Clayton County Gazette, was driving home from an assignment when she saw the steam engine. 29 years old journalism degree from Iowa State, she'd covered county fairs and school board meetings for 6 years. This was something different. She grabbed her camera from the passenger seat and started filming through the windshield, hands shaking with the realization that she was witnessing actual news. The sound traveled 5 miles across farmland, a sound that hadn't echoed through Clayton County since 1952. And everyone who heard it stopped what they were doing because they knew something extraordinary was about to happen. The construction crew heard Harold coming before they saw him. First, the sound, that deep rhythmic chuffing, like the breathing of something that shouldn't be alive but was. Then the ground vibration, the steel cleats biting into the county road with each rotation. Then the whistle as Harold announced his arrival, a shriek of steam that echoed across the flat Iowa landscape and made every head turn. The steam engine crested the small rise that overlooked the construction site, and for a moment everyone just stared. The machine was enormous. It dwarfed Harold's John Deere the way a grizzly bear dwarfs a house cat. The boiler gleamed black, freshly painted and polished. The brass fittings caught the September sun and threw back light like signal mirrors. The drive wheels, 6 feet tall and studded with cleats, turned slowly as Harold guided the engine down the slope toward the swamp. Bob stood with his arms crossed, watching. His smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. Something about the sheer mass of the approaching machine made mockery feel less appropriate. Kenneth muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ! Look at the size of that thing. It's an antique. Belongs in a museum." But Bob's voice had lost some of its certainty. The steam engine rolled closer, each chuff of its pistons shaking the ground, each rotation of those massive wheels demonstrating a kind of power that didn't show up on horsepower specifications. Harold drove the engine to the edge of the swamp about 200 feet from the stuck excavator. He set the brake with a lever that required both hands to move, climbed down, began uncoiling the chain from the back of the machine. "That chain won't hold." Kenneth said it automatically, engineer's instinct to calculate and doubt. But Harold didn't respond. He just kept uncoiling chain link after massive link steel that rang when it hit steel. "This chain is rated for 80 tons, and it's got some give to it. Steel cable doesn't stretch. When it hits its limit, it snaps. Chain stretches a little before it breaks, gives you time to back off." He walked the chain out toward the excavator, boots sinking into mud with each step. The ground was soft, but not bottomless. There was solid earth beneath the muck, maybe 4 or 5 feet down. Harold could feel it with each step, the way you learn to read ground when you've farmed the same land for 50 years. The construction crew watched in silence as the old man waded through the swamp chain over his shoulder like some mythological figure carrying the weight of the world. By the time he reached the excavator, he was covered in mud up to his chest. He hooked the chain to the machine's frame at the strongest point, tested the connection with his full weight, then waded back to solid ground. "You sure about this, old-timer?" Bob called out, and there was less mockery in his voice now, more genuine concern. "That machine's worth more than your whole farm. If something goes wrong, then I'll owe you an excavator, but nothing's going to go wrong." Harold climbed onto the steam engine's platform, checked his pressure gauges, put his hand on the throttle. The construction site had gone completely silent. 40 men holding their breath. Kenneth with his laptop closed. Rebecca with her phone forgotten in her hand. Brandon standing absolutely still, afraid to hope. Bob stood 20 feet away, arms no longer crossed, hands loose at his sides. For the first time in 3 days, he felt something other than despair or anger. He felt doubt about everything he thought he knew. As Hal's tractor disappeared over the hill, Bob felt something he hadn't felt in years, doubt about everything he thought he knew. What if this old farmer with his ancient machine was about to prove that 80 years of progress had missed something important? Harold opened the throttle. The steam engine responded with a sound nobody on that construction site had ever heard before. Deep, resonant, a rhythmic chunk, 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 as the pistons began to drive, as the gears engaged, as 80 years of engineering came to life under Harold's hand. The drive wheels started to turn. They didn't spin. They didn't slip. The steel cleats bit into the ground like teeth, each one finding purchase, each one gripping solid earth beneath the soft surface mud. The sound was distinct, not the whine of modern machinery fighting traction, but the deliberate bite of metal finding stone, finding clay, finding something that could push back. Kenneth Anderson stepped forward without thinking, drawn by the mechanics of what he was witnessing. His MIT education had taught him to understand machines through mathematics and computer models, but this was physics made visible, force made audible. He could see the torque translating through the drivetrain, see the massive wheels rotating at perhaps 60 revolutions per minute, slow enough to count, powerful enough to crack bedrock. Mr. McCormick. Harold didn't turn. His hand stayed on the throttle, his eyes on the pressure gauges, his entire body reading the machine through vibrations that traveled up through the platform into his bones. The chain went taut. The sound changed. Metal stress has its own voice, a hum, almost musical, as molecular bonds stretch and hold. The chain lifted off the ground between the steam engine and the excavator, droplets of mud falling away as it rose. As tension transformed it from a collection of links into a single, unbroken line of force. In the cab of the stuck excavator, the dashboard instruments rattled. The whole machine groaned metal, stressed by forces it had never experienced. Modern hydraulics were designed to apply power in controlled bursts, measured increments. This was different. This was continuous, relentless, the kind of pull that didn't ask permission or wait for sensors to approve. Kenneth reached the steam engine just as something happened that shouldn't have been possible. The excavator moved. Not much. An inch, maybe two, but it moved forward out of the hole that had trapped it for 3 days. Holy, the word died in Kenneth's throat. He stood 5 feet from the steam engine's massive rear wheel, close enough to feel heat radiating from the boiler, close enough to smell coal smoke and hot metal and the particular scent of steam under pressure. The wheel turned past him, cleats passing his face at eye level, each one leaving an impression in the earth 3 inches deep. Harold increased the throttle. The chuffing grew louder, more urgent. Steam consumption increased. The smoke from the stack turned from gray to black as the firebox demanded more air, more fuel, more energy to sustain the pull. The drive wheels rotated faster, still slow by modern standards, but faster than before their circumference, translating to forward force that defied the laws Kenneth thought he understood. "Mr. McCormick, I need to ask you something." Harold's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. His focus remained absolute. The pressure gauge showed 140 pounds, dropping from the initial 150, as steam drove the pistons, as power transferred from boiler to wheels to ground to chain to excavator. He'd need to maintain at least 120 to keep pulling. Below that, the force would diminish. The excavator would settle back. All this effort would accomplish nothing. But what Sarah and the crew didn't know was that Hal's hands were shaking as he opened the firebox. Not from fear of the machine, but from fear of failing his father's memory one more time. The excavator moved again. A foot this time, then another foot. The construction crew started screaming, not in panic, but in disbelief, in the sudden explosive release of 3 days of tension and frustration and helplessness. They were watching a 60-ton machine being pulled out of a swamp by something their great-grandfathers might have used, and the impossibility of it shattered their certainty about how the world worked. Kenneth had to raise his voice to be heard over the cheering, over the sound of the steam engine, over the sucking protest of mud releasing its grip. "Your chain! You said it was rated for 80 tons, but the cable we used was rated for 50. Why did ours snap and yours is holding?" Harold spared him a glance, quick assessing, deciding if this was genuine curiosity or engineering arrogance looking for flaws. Cable doesn't stretch. Hits its limit, instant failure, no warning. He gestured at the chain without taking his hand off the throttle. Chain has elasticity, stretches about 2% before breaking. Right now that chain is probably carrying 70 tons of load. It's stretched maybe 18 inches longer than its resting length. I can feel that stretch through the whole machine. Gives me time to adjust, throttle, prevent catastrophic failure. Kenneth's mind raced through calculations. 2% elasticity over 200 feet of chain meant, yes, roughly 18 inches of stretch. The math worked, but that wasn't what fascinated him. What fascinated him was the idea that this old farmer could feel chain elasticity through the vibrations of an 80-year-old machine, could read force and load without sensors or computers or digital displays. But your horsepower, our D8SS, make 300 horsepower each. You're only rated for 110. We couldn't move it with 600 combined horsepower, and you're doing it with 110. The physics doesn't. You're thinking horsepower. Harold's interruption was quiet, but absolute, delivered without looking away from his gauges. Think torque. The excavator was moving steadily now, 5 feet from where it had sat, 10 feet. The tracks were emerging from the swamp, black and dripping metal segments appearing one by one like the vertebrae of some prehistoric creature resurrecting itself from the tar pits. Horsepower measures how fast you do work. Speed times force. Your bulldozers, high RPM, high horsepower, built for speed. Perfect for pushing dirt on solid ground where traction is good and the load is distributed. He adjusted the throttle fractionally, compensating for a slight slip in the left wheel. So slight Kenneth hadn't noticed it, but Harold had felt it through the platform, through his feet, through decades of knowing this machine. Torque measures how much work you can do, rotational force. My steamer runs at 60 revolutions per minute maximum. Your dozers probably run at 1,800 and 2,000. But I've got 6-foot drive wheels with a 40-to-1 gear ratio. Massive mechanical advantage. Every revolution of these wheels delivers enormous force at ground level. The explanation unfolded while Harold worked his hands, never stopping his attention, never wavering from the task. Kenneth pulled out a small notebook, force of habit, the engineers need to document, and started scribbling numbers. Plus, there's traction. Your dozers started spinning when the load exceeded ground friction. Computer sensors detected wheel slip and cut power to protect the transmission. Smart engineering prevents damage. He nodded at the massive wheels still turning, cleats biting down through mud to solid earth. My steamer doesn't have sensors, doesn't know when to quit. It just pulls. These cleats are 4 inches long, driven down by 22 tons of machine weight. They're not gripping surface mud. They're finding clay 4 feet down, finding the bedrock shelf that runs under this whole swamp. That's what you needed. Not more power, but better grip. Kenneth looked down at his calculations, then up at the steam engine, then at the excavator, now 15 feet from the swamp. His MIT professors had taught him to trust models to believe that superior technology always won. But models couldn't account for this, for the way decades of experience could outperform computer sensors, for the way old engineering principles could solve problems new engineering couldn't touch. The ground pressure. We calculated that our excavator exerted 15 psi on the ground through its tracks. That's why it sank. The swamp couldn't support that much pressure. But you weigh 22 tons. Shouldn't you sink too? Harold allowed himself a slight smile. 22 tons distributed over 18 square feet of wheel contact area. That's about 1.2 psi. Plus those cleats are transferring load to solid ground below the surface. I'm not sinking because I'm not applying enough pressure to compress the mud. Weight distribution. Your machine was built for power. Mine was built for work. The distinction hit Kenneth like a revelation. Power versus work. Speed versus force. Modern versus functional. His entire education had been built on the assumption that newer was better, that technological advancement always meant superior performance. This 73-year-old farmer with an 80-year-old machine was demolishing that assumption one chain link at a time. 20 feet, 30 feet. The excavator was climbing now, rising from the swamp at an angle, gravity, and suction both fighting against the pull. Harold kept the throttle steady. The steam engine kept pulling. No variation in force, no faltering, just continuous, relentless forward motion driven by steam pressure and mechanical advantage and the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly what his machine could do. Bob had been standing motionless since the pull began. Now he walked closer, drawn by the same incomprehension that had pulled Kenneth forward. He stopped next to his chief engineer, and the two men stood together watching something that shouldn't be possible become undeniably real. Kenneth looked at him, eyes wide. "Boss, the math works. I didn't believe it could, but the math actually works." Bob didn't respond. He was watching Harold, the old man's weathered hands on the controls, the way he leaned slightly forward, as if listening to the machine, the small adjustments he made that were invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was mastery. The excavator cleared the swamp's edge, 40 feet from where it had sat for 3 days. The tracks found solid ground, and the load on the chain decreased instantly. Harold felt it adjusted the throttle down, compensated without conscious thought. The machine rolled forward more easily now, rolling up the slight incline to where the ground was firm enough to support its weight without assistance. 50 feet, 70 feet, 100 feet. Harold pulled it another 20 feet beyond what was strictly necessary just to be absolutely certain. Then he closed the throttle. The steam engine's chuffing slowed, the wheels rotated to a stop, and silence fell across the construction site. The kind of silence that follows miracles when people need a moment to convince themselves they actually witnessed what they just saw. Harold set the brake, reached for the whistle cord, pulled. The scream of steam echoed across the Iowa flatland, triumphant and ancient, the same sound that had announced the arrival of harvest crews 100 years ago, the same sound that had echoed across these fields when Harold's grandfather was young, when America ran on steam and iron will. The construction crew erupted, 40 men cheering, shouting, jumping, slapping each other on backs and shoulders, releasing 3 days of frustration in one explosive moment. Rebecca had her phone out calling corporate with the kind of news that people would think was a prank until they saw the photos. Brandon ran to the excavator, climbed into the cab, started the engine. It turned over immediately, ran smooth, completely undamaged. She's fine. No damage at all. More cheering. Someone started a chant, "Pull, pull, pull," and others joined in the word, becoming a drumbeat, becoming a celebration. Kenneth still stood next to the steam engine, looking at his notebook full of calculations that had finally started making sense. He understood now what had happened. Not just mechanically, he'd understood the mechanics within the first 30 seconds. He understood philosophically. He'd just witnessed the defeat of his own certainty, the collapse of assumptions he'd built a career on. But what nobody on that site knew was that Bob had spent 20 years building Mitchell Construction to prove he wasn't a failure. Every project mattered, every deadline counted. And this excavator sinking into the mud felt like watching everything he'd built slowly disappear. Now it sat on solid ground, saved, functional, worth its full value instead of scrap. Saved by a method he'd mocked, by a man he'd dismissed, by engineering principles he'd considered obsolete. Bob walked slowly toward the steam engine. His legs felt strange, as if the ground had changed texture beneath his feet. Harold was climbing down from the platform, moving with the careful deliberation of a 73-year-old body that had just performed 73-year-old labor. He was covered in mud from wading through the swamp. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear or weakness, but from the adrenaline that comes after sustained physical effort. "Mr. McCormick," Bob's voice came out rougher than he intended. Harold turned. Their eyes met. In that moment, Bob saw something he'd been too arrogant to see before: intelligence, experience, competence that didn't need credentials or corporate approval to be real. Bob Mitchell, who'd built a multi-million-dollar company on the belief that newer meant better, realized he'd just been schooled by a 73-year-old farmer and an 80-year-old machine. "I don't—" "How did you—" The words wouldn't come. Bob had spent 20 years being articulate, being certain, being the smartest man in the room. Now he stood in front of a mud-covered farmer in worn overalls and couldn't form a complete sentence. Harold wiped his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket, cleaning mud from between his fingers with the thorough attention of someone who'd cleaned his hands after hard work 1,000 times before. "Your equipment is good, Mr. Mitchell. Modern, powerful, built for 99% of the jobs you'll face. But this was the 1%, the job that needed something different." He gestured at the steam engine, at its massive wheels and gleaming boiler and brass fittings that caught the late afternoon sun. "Newer isn't always better. Sometimes the old ways work because they were designed for conditions the new ways never considered. Your bulldozers were designed for solid ground. My steamer was designed for mud." Bob's throat felt tight. His father had failed because he couldn't admit when he was wrong, couldn't accept help from people he considered beneath him. Bob had sworn he'd never be that man. Yet here he stood, having done exactly that, dismissed help because it came in the wrong package, from the wrong era, from someone who didn't fit his definition of expert. "I owe you an apology." The words came out before he'd decided to say them, raw and immediate. "I laughed at you, called your machine a museum piece, called you—" He stopped, unable to repeat the word "grandpa" now that it carried so much shame. "You were trying to help, and I mocked you in front of my whole crew. I was wrong." Harold studied him for a long moment. Around them, the celebration continued, workers examining the excavator, taking photos, replaying the pull in excited bursts of conversation. The sound felt distant, as if Bob and Harold existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. You were desperate. Desperate people say stupid things. I've said worse in my time. That doesn't excuse it. No, but it explains it. Harold folded the rag and put it back in his pocket. You've spent 20 years building your company. That takes intelligence, drive, refusal to accept limitations. Those are good qualities, but sometimes they can make a man blind to possibilities he hasn't imagined. You couldn't imagine my machine working because it didn't fit your understanding of how things should work. Bob nodded slowly. The words cut, but they cut true. How did you know it would work? Not hope, no. You were absolutely certain. Because I know my machine. I've fired her up 60 times in the past 5 years. Maintained every valve tested, every gear, learned every vibration and sound. When you know something that deeply, truly know it in your bones, confidence comes natural. He looked at the excavator now, surrounded by workers who were checking it over, running diagnostics, confirming what Brandon had already announced. Plus, I've been farming this land for 50 years. I know this ground. Know that there's bedrock 4 feet down running in a shelf under the whole swamp. Your surveyors marked the surface, but they didn't test the depth. If they had, they'd have known solid ground 4 feet down is all my cleats needed. Local knowledge. The kind that doesn't show up on surveys or computer models. The kind that comes from living in one place long enough to learn its secrets. Bob had dozens of projects across 3 states, never stayed in one place long enough to learn the ground the way Harold knew it. He'd considered that breadth of experience an advantage. Now he wondered what depth he'd sacrificed for coverage. Amanda Lewis appeared at the edge of their conversation, camera in hand, journalist's instinct telling her this moment mattered. She was young enough to be Bob's daughter, old enough to recognize when men were speaking truths they didn't share easily. Mr. McCormick, can I ask you a few questions for the Gazette? Harold shrugged, uncomfortable with attention, but too polite to refuse. How does it feel? Pulling out a $600,000 excavator with an 80-year-old machine, Harold considered the question carefully. Around him, men were still celebrating, still processing what they'd witnessed. The sun was getting lower, painting everything in warm golden light that made the steam engine look less like a machine and more like a monument. Feels like my grandfather was right all along. Some things don't need improving. They just need remembering. Amanda wrote that down, underlining it twice. She understood, without being able to articulate, why that she'd just heard the quote that would become the headline, the line that would get repeated, the sentence that would outlive the event itself. What made you think to try when everyone else said it was impossible? Harold looked at Bob, who was listening intently, and chose his words with care. I didn't think. I knew. There's a difference. Thinking is what you do with problems you haven't seen before. Knowing is what comes from experience. I've pulled things out of mud before. I've used this machine for work other people said couldn't be done. I knew it would work the same way I know the sun will rise tomorrow. Not because I hope so, but because it always has. Rebecca joined them, phone still in hand, corporate still on the line. Mr. Mitchell, they want to know what to put in the report. How do we explain that a steam tractor from 1912 succeeded where modern equipment failed. Bob looked at Harold, then at the steam engine, then back at his project manager. Tell them we learned something. Tell them that torque beats horsepower when the ground won't support speed. Tell them that sometimes the best solution is the one we stopped using 50 years ago because we forgot why it worked in the first place. Rebecca blinked clearly, not expecting that answer. She'd worked for Bob for 2 years, and he'd never once admitted that modern methods could fail where old methods succeeded. She raised the phone back to her ear. "Did you get that, S? I know it sounds crazy. I'm looking at the excavator right now. It's out. It's functional. I don't care if it sounds impossible, I'm telling you what happened." Kenneth approached, notebook still open, pen still moving, as ideas connected in his engineer's mind. "Mr. McCormick, would you be willing to teach me about steam engines, about the old engineering principles, not the history, the actual functional mechanics, how to read a machine without sensors, how to calculate load by feel, how to—" He stopped, suddenly aware he was asking a favor from a man his boss had insulted an hour ago. "I understand if you'd rather not, after how we treated you, but MIT taught me formulas. You just taught me wisdom. There's a difference." Harold looked at the young engineer, saw genuine curiosity instead of condescension, saw someone willing to learn instead of someone certain he already knew everything. "Saturday mornings. Bring coffee. I'll teach you." Kenneth's face split into a grin. "Thank you. Really, thank you." The celebration was starting to wind down as the reality of the situation settled in. The excavator was safe. The project could continue. The deadline was still tight, but no longer impossible. Men returned to their equipment, preparing to secure the site for the night. The immediate crisis had passed. Bob pulled out his checkbook, the same instinct that had guided him through 20 years of business. Solve problems with money, negotiate terms, establish transactions. "What do I owe you?" Harold shook his head. "I told you before. Donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. Whatever you think 3 days of delays cost you. 70,000 in direct losses. Schedule penalties bring it higher. Then give them 10,000. They preserve machines like mine. Keep history alive for when people need reminding that the old ways still work." Bob wrote the check without hesitation. $10,000 to the Clayton County Historical Society. In the memo line he wrote, "For preserving what still matters." Harold took the check, folded it carefully, put it in his overall pocket next to the rag. "One more thing. I want to hire you as a consultant. I've got projects across Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota. Sometimes we run into problems that don't have standard solutions. I need someone who thinks differently. I'm 73 years old, and you just outperformed my entire engineering team. Age isn't the issue. Wisdom is the asset." Harold considered this, looking at Bob with new assessment. The arrogance was gone from the younger man's face, replaced by something that looked like respect. That mattered more than money, more than apologies, more than anything Bob could offer. "I won't leave my farm. You come to me when you need help." Bob extended his hand. "Deal." They shook, and something shifted in that moment, not just between two men, but between two philosophies, two generations, two different understandings of how the world worked. Neither would articulate it, but both felt it. A bridge had been built where a wall had stood. Harold climbed back onto the steam engine. The crew stopped what they were doing to watch, sensing that this departure mattered, that they'd witnessed something they'd tell their grandchildren about. He checked his gauges, released the brake, opened the throttle gently. The engine responded with that familiar chuffing, the wheels began to turn, and black smoke rose from the stack as Harold guided the machine back toward the county road. The whistle sounded one more time, a farewell, an announcement, a reminder that would echo in the memories of everyone who heard it. As Hal drove the steam engine home that evening, black smoke trailing behind him like a victory banner, Bob stood in the fading light and faced a truth. Everything he'd built his career on speed power, technology had just been beaten by patience, torque, and wisdom. The construction site slowly returned to normal activity. Men securing equipment, preparing for tomorrow's work, talking among themselves about what they'd seen. But the conversation had changed. No one was laughing at old methods anymore. No one was dismissing the possibility that solutions could come from unexpected places. Kenneth stood next to Bob, both men watching the steam engine disappear over the rise, the sound of it fading into the distance. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen." Bob nodded slowly. "That was a 73-year-old farmer teaching me that I don't know everything. That was humility delivered with 22 tons of cast iron and steam pressure. Think we'll actually call him for consulting." Bob looked at the excavator sitting on solid ground, saved from destruction, worth $600,000 instead of scrap value. He looked at his crew, energized, in a way they hadn't been for weeks, talking about possibilities instead of limitations. He looked at the swamp, at the tracks left by the steam engine's cleats, at the evidence that the impossible had just become fact. Every single time we hit a problem that doesn't have a standard solution, every time our modern equipment can't do the job, every time we need someone who understands that newer doesn't always mean better. The sun touched the horizon, painting the Iowa sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. Somewhere in the distance, too far to hear now, a steam whistle sounded across farmland, announcing to anyone listening that the old ways were still alive, still functional, still capable of saving the day when everything else failed. Bob pulled out his phone and dialed corporate, preparing to explain something that would sound like fiction, that would challenge everything their engineering department believed, that would require him to defend methods he'd mocked just hours ago. But as he waited for someone to answer, he found himself smiling, because for the first time in 3 days, the excavator wasn't sinking. For the first time in 3 days, he had a solution. And for the first time in 20 years, he'd learned something that couldn't be taught in a classroom or found in a computer model. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to forget, and then they remind us. Harold drove the steam engine back to his farm as the September sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in colors that would fade before he finished cleaning the mud from his clothes. The 2-mile journey felt longer than usual, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of what had just happened. He'd proven something today, not just to Bob Mitchell and his crew, but to himself. The old ways could still save the day when the new ways failed. The farm appeared as it always did, white clapboard house with green shutters, barn that housed modern equipment. His grandfather never could have imagined, and behind it all, the shed where the steam engine lived. Harold parked the machine in its designated space, the same spot it had occupied since 1913, and began the shutdown procedure. You couldn't just turn off a steamer the way you killed a diesel engine. The fire had to die gradually. The pressure had to bleed off slowly. The metal had to cool at a rate that wouldn't crack the boiler. He worked in the fading light, going through motions he'd performed 60 times before. But this time, felt different. This time, the engine had done what it was built to do, not demonstrate history at a county fair, not educate schoolchildren about their heritage, but actually work, actually save something valuable, actually prove that August McCormick's $3,000 investment in 1912 still mattered in 1992. The mud came off the drive wheels in chunks, revealing the steel cleats beneath. Harold scrubbed each one clean, checking for damage, finding none. The chain went back on its rack links, inspected individually, every connection point examined for stress fractures or weak spots. None. 80 tons of rated capacity, 70 tons of actual load, and the chain had performed exactly as designed. By the time full darkness arrived, Harold's body had started sending bills for the day's labor. 73 years old meant every joint complained, every muscle reminded him that wading through swamps and operating heavy machinery extracted costs that compounded with age. But his mind felt lighter than it had in years. He walked to the house boots, leaving mud prints on the back porch, and stopped at the door. Through the window, he could see the kitchen exactly as Rose had left it 5 years ago. He'd changed nothing. The curtains she'd sewn in 1987, the table they'd refinished together in 1989, the photograph on the wall, their wedding day, 1951, both of them young and certain that the future would be kind. It's your father's legacy, Hal, and your grandfather's. Keep it alive. Her words, spoken in the shed during the restoration, came back now with the clarity of fresh memory. Rose had understood something Harold hadn't fully grasped until today. The steam engine wasn't just a machine. It was proof that good work outlasted the people who did it. That quality endured. That building things to last meant they would last even when everyone else had moved on to disposable alternatives. Harold cleaned up, ate a simple dinner, and sat on the front porch as night settled over Clayton County. The phone had rung 4 times already. Neighbors who'd heard the whistle, seen the steam engine on the road, wanted to know what happened. He'd let the calls go to the answering machine. Tomorrow would be soon enough for explanations. The stars came out, the same stars August had seen from this porch in 1912, the same stars that would shine long after Harold was gone. Somewhere out there, Bob Mitchell was probably still explaining to his corporate masters how an 80-year-old machine had succeeded where modern equipment failed. Let him explain. Let them struggle with the cognitive dissonance. Sometimes the best lessons were the ones that didn't make sense until you stopped trying to force them into familiar frameworks. Harold thought about his father, Thomas McCormick, who'd inherited the steam engine but never used it, who'd chosen diesel tractors for their convenience and speed. Thomas hadn't been wrong. Diesel was more practical for 99% of farming tasks, but he'd missed the 1%, the situations where the old iron still mattered. Harold had almost made the same mistake, almost let the engine sit unused forever, almost let his grandfather's investment become nothing more than a museum curiosity. I kept it beating Rose, and it saved the day. The words came out as a whisper, addressed to darkness and memory, and the absolute certainty that somewhere, somehow, she knew. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks. The sound of a truck engine woke Harold at 7 the next morning. He recognized the diesel rumble, heavy-duty Ford, probably a 3/4 ton, the kind contractors drove. He was still pulling on his boots when he heard footsteps on the gravel drive heading toward the shed. Bob Mitchell stood in the shed doorway when Harold arrived, hands in his pockets, looking at the steam engine in morning light. The machine gleamed where Harold had cleaned it dull, where mud still clung to surfaces he hadn't reached. Bob turned at the sound of Harold's approach, and his face carried an expression Harold had seen before on men who'd come to admit they were wrong on people who'd arrived at truths they'd spent years avoiding. "Mr. McCormick." Harold didn't respond immediately. He walked to his workbench, picked up a clean rag, and began wiping down the boiler's brass fittings. Not because they needed it, but because his hands needed something to do while this conversation unfolded. Came to apologize. Properly this time. Nothing to apologize for. Yes, there is. Bob stepped into the shed, out of the bright morning sun, into shadows that smelled of machine oil and coal dust and history. He looked around at the tools hanging on pegboards, at the parts organized in labeled bins, at the maintenance log Harold kept in a binder on a shelf, every firing recorded, every repair documented. "I laughed at you, in front of 40 men, called your machine a museum piece, called you—" He stopped, the word catching in his throat. "I was disrespectful, arrogant, wrong, and I need to say that out loud, need you to hear it, because what you did yesterday, it wasn't just pulling out an excavator. You proved that everything I've built my career on is incomplete at best, wrong at worst." Harold set down the rag and turned to face Bob fully. "Your career's built on good principles. Modern equipment, proper training, efficiency. Those things matter. They're not wrong, but they're not sufficient. No, sometimes they're not." The admission hung between them, heavy, with implications neither man wanted to fully explore. Bob pulled out a crate, the same one Kenneth had sat on the day before, and lowered himself onto it with the slow movement of someone carrying invisible weight. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone on my crew?" Harold leaned against the workbench, waiting. "My father failed at a bridge project in 1975. I was 12. Watched him lose everything, the business, our house, his reputation. He died thinking he was a failure, and I spent 20 years proving I wasn't him. Building bigger, going faster, refusing to accept limitations." Bob looked up, meeting Harold's eyes. "Yesterday, a 73-year-old farmer with an 80-year-old machine showed me I'd become exactly like him. Not in the failing, in the arrogance, in the certainty that my way was the only way, in the refusal to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone else might know something I didn't." The morning sun had climbed higher, sending beams through gaps in the shed's wallboards, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow in still air. Harold understood what this confession cost. Men like Bob Mitchell, self-made, successful, certain, didn't admit vulnerability easily. The fact that he was doing it here in a shed behind a farmhouse, speaking to a man he'd mocked 24 hours ago, meant something had fundamentally shifted. "Your father and mine probably had more in common than either would have liked to admit." Harold's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "My father inherited this engine but never used it. Chose diesel for everything. Faster, easier, more convenient. He wasn't wrong. Diesel was better for most things. But he missed the situations where the old iron still mattered. I almost made the same mistake. Almost let this machine become a relic instead of a tool." He gestured at the steam engine. "We're all trying to outrun our father's shadows. You, by succeeding bigger me, by preserving what he abandoned. But maybe that's the wrong race. Maybe the point isn't to be different from them or the same as them. Maybe it's to learn what they knew and what they didn't, and build something that includes both." Bob's throat worked, swallowing against emotion he hadn't expected to feel. How did you know yesterday when everyone said it was impossible? How did you know it would work? Because I trusted this machine more than I trusted opinions. I'd fired her up 60 times, tested every system, learned every sound and vibration. When you know something that deeply, when you've put in the hours to understand it at a molecular level, confidence isn't arrogance, it's earned certainty. Bob nodded slowly. I don't know my equipment that way. I know what the manuals say, what the dealers claim, what the computer readouts tell me, but I don't know them. Not the way you know this engine. That's modern business. You can't know everything intimately when you've got 50 pieces of equipment across 3 states, but you can know when to trust people who do know. Yesterday, you made a choice. Trust your own certainty or trust my experience. Took you 3 days, but you made the right choice. The words carried no judgment, just observation. Bob appreciated that Harold wasn't rubbing salt in the wound, wasn't making him feel worse for the delay. Just acknowledging that decisions get made on timelines that aren't always optimal. Kenneth wants to learn from you. Asked yesterday if he could come on Saturdays. Smart young man. MIT degree isn't worth less because it's incomplete. Just means he's got room to grow. And me. Do I have room to grow? Harold considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Yesterday, you were willing to try something you thought was crazy because you'd run out of options. That's not growth, that's desperation. Real growth would be calling me before you waste 3 days on methods that won't work. Real growth would be asking, what solution fits this specific problem? Instead of, what's the most modern solution I can apply? Bob absorbed that, turning it over in his mind. So, when I have a problem, I should ask, what would Harold do know? Ask what the problem needs. Sometimes that's modern equipment. Sometimes that's old methods. Sometimes that's something nobody's thought of yet. The trick is matching the solution to the situation, not forcing the situation to fit your preferred solution. That might be the smartest thing anyone said to me in 20 years. It's what my grandfather told my father in 1935 when diesel tractors first showed up. My father didn't listen. Took me 50 years to figure out what August McCormick already knew. Progress isn't about replacing old with new. It's about having both available and knowing which to use when. Footsteps on gravel announced Kenneth's arrival. He appeared in the shed doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner in town, steam rising from the lids in the cool morning air. Figured you'd be here, boss. Brought you coffee. Mr. McCormick, I brought you some too if you drink it. Harold accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. Saturday mornings, you said. I wanted to confirm you meant that I don't say things I don't mean. Bring coffee every week, and I'll teach you what MIT didn't. Kenneth's grin could have lit the shed without electricity. Steam engines, torque recalculations, reading machines without sensors, all of that. Plus, when to use old methods and when to trust new ones. Most important lesson you'll learn. Bob stood pulling his checkbook from his jacket. Yesterday, I wrote a check to the Historical Society. Today, I want to write one to you. Consulting fee, retainer, whatever you want to call it. Harold shook his head. Already told you donation to the society. They're the ones preserved the knowledge I used yesterday. They're the ones keeping history alive when everyone else wants to forget it. 10,000 wasn't enough. What you did was worth what it was worth. Money doesn't change that. Bob put the checkbook away, recognizing immovable certainty when he encountered it. Then, let me hire you as a consultant. Not for money, for knowledge. I've got projects across Iowa where we hit problems that don't have standard solutions. I need someone who thinks differently, who can look at a situation and see possibilities I'm blind to. Harold considered this, sipping coffee that was still too hot to drink properly. "I won't leave my farm, won't travel to job sites unless they're local, but you can call me, ask questions, bring problems that need solving. That's all I'm asking." They shook hands, and this time the gesture carried weight that yesterday's handshake had lacked. Yesterday was transaction payment for services rendered. Today was partnership acknowledgement that different kinds of knowledge had equal value. Kenneth pulled out his notebook. "Mr. McCormick, can I start now? I've got questions about ground pressure calculations, about how you knew the bedrock depth without testing." Harold smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost young. "First lesson, patience. You don't start learning before you've finished your coffee. Respect the pause between work sessions. It's where the understanding settles." Kenneth closed his notebook, chagrined but accepting. "Yes, sir." The three men stood in the shed, drinking coffee as morning light grew stronger, as the day warmed toward afternoon temperatures, as the moment stretched into something that would be remembered later as the beginning of things, of Kenneth's education, in old methods of Bob's humility, of Harold's second career as the man who proved the past still mattered. The phone calls started coming that afternoon. News traveled fast in Clayton County. Amanda Lewis's article hit the Gazette's morning edition, complete with photographs of the steam engine pulling the excavator, quotes from crew members who'd witnessed the impossible become fact. By noon, the story had been picked up by the Des Moines Register. By evening, a television crew from Cedar Rapids was calling to schedule an interview. Harold declined most of them. He wasn't interested in fame, didn't want attention, had no desire to become the face of some nostalgia movement. But word spread regardless, an old farmer with an older machine performing rescues that modern equipment couldn't handle. The first call for help came in October, 4 weeks after the excavator rescue. Richard Wilson, farmer from 3 counties over, had a combine stuck in a swamp during harvest. The rental company's recovery team had tried for 2 days, failed, told him he'd have to wait until the ground froze solid to extract the machine. That meant losing the entire soybean harvest, missing the market window, potentially losing the farm. "Mr. McCormick, I know you're probably busy, probably tired of people asking favors, but I heard what you did for Mitchell Construction, and I'm desperate." Harold listened to the whole story before responding. "How far out are you? 40 miles. I can pay. Keep your money. If I can get it out, donate whatever you think it's worth to the Clayton County Historical Society." He arrived the next morning, steam engine fired and ready, and pulled Richard's combine free in 90 minutes. The farmer tried to pay cash, tried to write a check, tried everything he could think of to express gratitude beyond words. Harold refused it, all gave him the Historical Society's address. Drove home thinking about how strange it felt to be needed for something beyond farming his own land. The donation that arrived at the Historical Society 2 weeks later was $2,000. November brought a logging company from across the state line, bulldozer, stuck in forest bog, inaccessible to conventional recovery equipment. Harold pulled it out in an afternoon. $5,000 donation. March 1993 brought a county road grader that had broken through spring thaw mud. County supervisor called Harold personally, asking if the stories were true. If he could really pull out equipment modern methods couldn't budge. $3,000 donation. By the end of 1993, Harold had performed 5 rescues. By the end of 1994, the number was 9, and in August 1994, Bob Mitchell called with a problem. Harold hadn't expected another excavator stuck at another Highway 52 site. Different location, but identical situation. I know it's asking a lot, having you bail me out twice, but not asking a lot, asking the right person for the right job. I'll be there tomorrow. Bob's voice carried relief and something else, warmth maybe, or respect that had deepened into actual friendship. Kenneth's been practicing what you taught him. He calculated the ground pressure before we even started work, flagged this area as unstable. We tried to avoid it, but sometimes the job requires going where the ground won't hold you. Exactly. Harold pulled the second excavator out without difficulty. The procedure now familiar, the result never in doubt. Bob donated another $10,000 to the Historical Society. Kenneth attended his Saturday morning sessions with religious devotion, bringing coffee, bringing questions, bringing a humility that transformed his MIT education from sailing to foundation. The local Historical Society director, Dorothy Allen, called Harold in early 1997 with news that still felt unreal. Mr. McCormick, thanks to your rescues and the donations they've generated, we've raised enough money to build a proper museum. Not just a room in the library, an actual building dedicated to preserving steam-area equipment and the knowledge that goes with it. Harold sat on his porch phone pressed to his ear, looking at the shed where the steam engine waited. That's wonderful, Dorothy. Congratulations. We want your case to be the centerpiece. Not permanently. We know you still use it. But we want to build the display around it. Tell its story, use it as proof that preservation isn't about storing dead things. It's about keeping functional history alive. The museum opened in June 1997, a building funded by $50,000 in donations generated by Harold's rescues. The exhibit featured photographs of every pull testimonials from the people Harold had helped, technical specifications that explained why the old machine could do what modern equipment couldn't. The centerpiece was a temporary space where Harold's case sat when he brought it for demonstrations, along with a plaque that visitors quoted long after they'd forgotten the rest of the museum. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. Bob attended the opening ceremony, bringing his entire management team, requiring them to tour the exhibits and understand the lessons the museum taught. Kenneth gave a presentation on torque versus horsepower that drew on both his MIT education and Harold's practical instruction, demonstrating how the old and new knowledge could work together instead of competing. By 2001, Harold had performed 11 rescues. The Clayton County Historical Society had become a regional destination, drawing visitors from neighboring states, hosting educational programs that taught young engineers about principles their universities had stopped covering decades ago. And Harold, now 82 years old, still fired up the steam engine once a month, still maintained it with obsessive care, still answered calls for help when local farmers or contractors hit problems that required old solutions. September 18, 2001 arrived with the kind of clear morning that made Iowa famous blue sky, light breeze temperature perfect for porch sitting. The nation was still reeling from the attacks 7 days earlier, still processing grief and rage and fear about what came next. Harold sat in his usual chair, coffee in hand, watching sunrise paint his land in colors that would fade by mid-morning. The steam engine was visible from the porch, sitting in its shed, ready for the monthly fire-up scheduled for Saturday. Christopher Mitchell, Bob's grandson, now 19 and studying mechanical engineering at Iowa State, was supposed to come help learning the procedure, the way Kenneth had learned it, the way knowledge passed from one generation to the next when people cared enough to teach it. Harold felt the pain start in his chest, not sharp, just present, like pressure building. He recognized it immediately. His father had died of a heart attack. His grandfather had too. The McCormick men didn't linger. He set down his coffee cup carefully, not wanting to spill it, not wanting to leave a mess for whoever found him. The pain increased, but didn't spike, just expanded steadily, filling his chest the way steam filled a boiler, reaching pressure demanding release. Harold thought about Rose, about how she'd been waiting 5 years for him to join her, thought about his father and grandfather, about whether they watched somehow, whether they knew that the machine they'd bought and preserved had mattered after all. Thought about Bob Mitchell and Kenneth Anderson and all the young people who'd learned from him, who'd carry forward the knowledge that the old ways still worked when you needed them. The pain reached its peak and then mercifully stopped. Harold slumped in his chair, eyes still open, still looking at the shed, still seeing the steam engine that had been his purpose and his pride for 13 years. A small smile touched his lips, satisfaction maybe, or relief, or the simple peace of knowing he'd done what he set out to do. Christopher found him 2 hours later, arriving early for the fire-up lesson, calling out a greeting that went unanswered. He stood on the porch for a long moment, understanding without being told, feeling the weight of inheritance settle onto shoulders that suddenly felt too young for it. The funeral 3 days later drew 500 people, every farmer Harold had helped, every contractor who'd called him for advice. Bob Mitchell, with his entire company, Kenneth Anderson, with his wife and children, Dorothy Allen, with the entire Historical Society board. Steam engines from 5 states rumbled into Clayton County, their owners coming to honor one of their own, their whistles echoing across the land in a farewell salute that would have made Harold smile if he could have heard it. Bob gave the eulogy, speaking to a crowd that overflowed the church and spilled onto the lawn outside. Harold McCormick saved my business in 1992. Not just an excavator, my business, my reputation, everything I'd built. But more than that, he taught me something I'd forgotten in my rush toward progress. He taught me that wisdom doesn't come from newness. It comes from understanding what works and why it works and when to use it. His voice caught cleared, continued. This country just experienced a terrible tragedy. We're all looking for what endures, for what we can count on when everything else fails. Harold's steam engine endured. 89 years old when he died, and it still runs, still works, still saves the day when modern methods can't. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces, reflecting grief and gratitude in equal measure. Harold built his life like that engine was built to last, to serve, to prove that quality outlasts convenience, that good work outlives the people who do it. The engine will keep running. Harold made sure of that. He trained young people to maintain it, to understand it, to use it. The whistle will still sound across these fields every month, and every time it does, we'll remember what Harold taught us. Pastor Timothy Moore spoke next, his words measured and meaningful. Harold once told me that the old ways aren't better because they're old. They're better because time tested them. If they survived, there's a reason. In this week of national grief, we see what survives, not buildings, not technology, but courage and community and the wisdom to know what matters. Christopher inherited the farm and the steam engine. 19 years old, mechanical engineering student, he'd spent 2 years learning from Harold, absorbing knowledge the way Kenneth had absorbed it a decade earlier. the first time he fired up the engine after the funeral. October 6, 2001, the procedure felt sacred. Every step Harold had taught him, every gauge check, every valve test performed with the reverence of ritual. When the whistle sounded that day, Christopher could have sworn he heard Harold's voice in it. His grandfather, August's voice, all the McCormick men who'd stood where he stood, hands on the throttle of a machine that refused to become obsolete. The years passed. Christopher graduated, took a job with a manufacturing company, kept the farm running with hired help, kept the steam engine maintained with religious devotion. Every first Saturday of the month, he fired it up. Every call for help he answered. The rescues continued 2000, 2005, 2008, 2011. Modern equipment getting stuck, old iron pulling it free, the pattern repeating itself with the regularity of seasons. 2015 arrived with a phone call Christopher half expected, almost dreaded, definitely saw coming. "Christopher, this is Andrew Mitchell, Bob Mitchell's son. I'm running Mitchell Construction now. Dad retired 5 years ago, and I've got a problem." Christopher already knew what kind of problem it would be. "Highway 52. How did you—" "Because it's always Highway 52. "What happened?" "New excavator, newest model, all the bells and whistles. And it's 8 feet down in the same swamp that caught my grandfather's excavator in 1992. Christopher smiled despite himself. Tried modern recovery methods, everything. Dad's retired, but Kenneth Anderson is still our chief engineer. He's 58 now, but sharp as ever. Kenneth calculated everything, tried everything. He finally said there's only one solution. Let me guess. Fire up the case." "Yeah." "Christopher, I know it's been 14 years since Harold passed. I know you've got your own life, but I'll be there tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Have your crew ready." The 2015 rescue drew a crowd that included Amanda Lewis, now 52, and senior reporter at the Register, Kenneth Anderson, whose hair had gone gray, but whose notebook still filled with calculations, and Bob Mitchell, 73 years old and officially retired, but unable to resist witnessing history repeat itself. Christopher operated the steam engine with the confidence Harold had shown, the same careful attention to gauges, the same feel for the machine's capabilities. The case, now 103 years old, performed exactly as it had in 1992, pulling the excavator free in the same 3 minutes, proving the same point to a new generation of engineers who'd forgotten the lessons their predecessors had learned. Andrew stood next to his father as the excavator emerged from the swamp, shaking his head in disbelief. "How is this possible? That machine is older than you, Dad. Older than Grandpa was when it pulled out his excavator." Bob, leaning on a cane now, but still sharp-eyed, answered quietly. "It's possible because Christopher maintains it right, because Harold understood that a well-built machine doesn't wear out if you treat it properly, because your great-grandfather learned a lesson in 1992 that you're learning today. Newer doesn't always mean better." Kenneth walked to the steam engine where Christopher was shutting down the system's bleeding pressure, beginning the cool-down sequence. "Mr. McCormick, that was textbook perfect. Harold would be proud. Hope so. He taught me everything I know about this machine. Some lessons stick. I've taught 100 engineers what Harold taught me. Most of them get the math. Only a few get the philosophy." Andrew approached, humbled and curious in equal measure. "Mr. McCormick, could I learn?" "Not just about this machine specifically, but about the principles behind it, about when old methods work better than new ones." Christopher looked at Kenneth, Then at Bob, seeing the pattern repeat itself across generations. He smiled, Harold's smile, patient and knowing. Saturday mornings, bring coffee. Think about it. How many times have you dismissed something just because it was old? How many times have we confused newness with superiority, convenience with quality speed, with effectiveness? That steam engine is 103 years old at this moment in the story. Your smartphone will be obsolete in 3 years. Makes you wonder what we've lost in our rush forward, doesn't it? The years continued. 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022. The steam engine kept running, kept performing rescues, kept proving that Harold had been right. Some things don't become obsolete because they were built properly in the first place. The Clayton County Historical Society Museum expanded, adding interactive exhibits that taught young engineers the principles Harold had taught Kenneth, that Kenneth had taught dozens of others that would continue teaching as long as people cared to learn. By 2024, the case had performed 73 rescues, 73 pieces of modern equipment saved from destruction by a machine built when Woodrow Wilson was president, when the Titanic had just sunk, when America still ran on steam and iron certainty. Christopher, now 42, still fired the engine every first Saturday, still maintained it with obsessive care, still answered every call for help. In July 2024, a company using electric excavators, the newest technology AI-assisted autonomous operation, called with a problem their computers couldn't solve. We've tried everything our systems can calculate. The AI says extraction is impossible. But we heard about you about what that old machine can do. Christopher arrived the next morning. The electric excavator's operators watched in fascination as the steam engine, predating electricity, as a common power source, pulled their cutting-edge equipment free without difficulty. The company donated $15,000 to the Historical Society, the largest single contribution in the museum's history. That evening, a young woman approached Christopher as he cleaned mud from the drive wheels. Emma Taylor, 24, fresh from Stanford, with a mechanical engineering degree and a head full of theories that had just encountered reality. Mr. McCormick, I don't understand the physics. That excavator has 600 horsepower equivalent in its electric motors. Your engine has 110. How did you succeed? Where we failed. Christopher set down his cleaning rag. Seeing himself at 19, seeing Kenneth at 35, seeing Harold at 73, all of them arriving at the same understanding through different paths. You're thinking horsepower. Think purpose. That excavator was built to dig fast. This engine was built to pull slow. Different tools for different jobs. He gestured at the steam engine. Stanford taught you optimization, how to make machines efficient for their design purpose, but Harold McCormick taught me wisdom, understanding that sometimes the best solution isn't the most optimized one. Sometimes it's the one that was built for a job everyone else forgot needed doing. Emma pulled out her phone, ready to take notes, then stopped herself. Could I learn not just about this machine, but about the philosophy behind it, about when to use old methods? Christopher smiled, the expression carrying echoes of Harold and Bob and Kenneth and all the people who'd learned that progress wasn't about choosing between old and new, but about knowing when each mattered. Saturday mornings, bring coffee. The steam engine sat in its shed that night. Metal cooling pressure bled to zero, ready for the next fire-up in 4 weeks. Outside, The Iowa stars shone with the same light they'd cast in 1912 when August McCormick first brought the machine home. The same light they'd cast in 1992 when Harold proved it still mattered, the same light they'd cast across every rescue and every lesson and every moment when someone learned that newer doesn't always mean better. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to forget, and then they remind us what actually matters.